So again, welcome everybody to, got a lot of folks from New York here, it looks like. Welcome to this master class with Professor Konstantin Sonin. He is the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor here at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. And his research interests include political economics, conflict development, and economic theory. His papers have been published in leading economic journals in economics and political science. Professor Sonin earned his MSc and PhD in mathematics from Moscow State University and an MA in economics from Moscow's New Economics School. He was a postdoctorate fellow at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a visiting professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, just up the way from us. And he also served on the faculty of NES and HSCE University in Moscow. In addition to his academic work, Professor Sonin has been writing columns and op-eds and a blog on Russian political and economic issues. And with that, I am excited to turn this over to Professor Sonin.
Thank you, Blake. So today I'm going to talk about what happened on January 6, 2021 in Washington, D.C. This talk is based on my joint work with David Van Dyke from the University of Michigan and my colleague and most popular teacher at Harris, Professor Wright. So what happened on January 6 in 2021 in Washington, D.C. was a very unusual thing. So you could see that the capital of the seat of the United States Congress was basically taken by rioters, and the last time the capital was taken by someone by force was more than 200 years ago, when British troops briefly occupied Washington, D.C. in the 1812. Since then, this has never happened. In the United States, there have been some controversies about the election results. Sometimes there were accusations that elections were stolen, and perhaps they were once stolen back almost 150 years ago, but in the current generations, there had never been anything like this. So this was an extremely unfamiliar sight for those who watch, for those who study, who analyze American politics. But if you look around the world, then post-election protests are actually quite common. So in this picture, you see the protests in Ukraine in 2004, when the elections were blatantly stolen from a pro-Western candidate, and the huge protests ensued, and they basically forced to change the electoral rules to have a new round of elections, which were won by the candidate that won before the elections were stolen. The black and white picture is a famous rallies in 1986, when Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos announced that he won the elections, although he apparently lost the elections. Philippine people were not content with this. They made huge protests. They came out and they forced the incumbent to resign, and the winner of the elections was restored. Of course, not every protest is successful, and not every protest results in the elections being overturned. So the bottom picture with the red and white flags, it's from Belarusian elections back in 2020. It's almost clear for everyone who did election forensics, for every person who analyzed the data on elections, that it was the challenger, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who won this election, defeating the incumbent, President Lukashenko, but the president controlled the Central Election Commission. He was announced the winner. He moved very fast to destroy all the election bulletins, all the evidence that he lost the elections. And although the protests were huge, Western countries never seen such huge protests as a percentage of the population. Lukashenko is still the president. Tikhanovskaya, the true president, is still in exile. So the point is that these things happen, and our study is just trying to figure out what was happening, why it happened, especially because what we know, not from our paper, but from many other papers, from both election analysis, from legal analysis, that the elections were not stolen in 2020, right? So in 2020, what happened is that the incumbent President Trump lost election to the challenger, to Joe Biden, relatively narrow. A small swing of votes, 10,000 votes in Arizona, 12,000 votes in Georgia, 20,000 votes in the state of Wisconsin, and Donald Trump would have been president. Actually, I put a small, almost unnoticeable advertisement for my different paper on the Electoral College that explains how the Electoral College protects American elections from the electoral fraud, but it's just an advertisement. Basically, President Trump lost the elections, but it was relatively narrow. But before the elections, both in 2016, which Donald Trump won, and 2020, which Donald Trump lost, candidate Trump told his voters that if he loses, then the only reason why he had lost is that this was because of the fraud. So this lecture is too short to talk about the system with which Americans elect their presidents. It's a very complicated system. It's extremely fascinating, but it's really complicated. What's important is that American voters elect presidents voting by states. States determine the procedure, and states count the votes. So there was an important factor that amplified the election integrity concerns in 2020. Because of the pandemic, a lot of states relied massively on early and mail vote. Then states differed in ways they counted these votes. So some states did not start counting the votes before the election day. Some states counted the votes before the mail vote, the absentee vote, before the election day. So when on the election day, the precincts were closed, so the voting ended, some states already have the votes of the absentee voters and of the mail voters have already them counted and immediately released the numbers. Some of the states were not able to do this because by their own design, they started to count these votes only on the election night. So they started to count it after the election precincts were closed. So there was a big difference in the votes that were cast on the election day and the votes that was there in the mail vote, because parties diverged and quite significantly on the attitude to pandemic. So Democrats encouraged their voters to vote by mail. Republicans, who were less concerned, their candidate was less concerned about the COVID and the restrictions related to COVID, encouraged their voters to vote on the election day. So in some states, there was an expectation, and professionals, of course, knew this. There were a lot of articles. It was well predicted in advance that over the night there will be votes that were not counted before the election day, and they will be added to the vote total. So in Pennsylvania, in the evening of the election day, it looked like President Trump is winning. But everyone, including the Trump campaign advisors, they knew that, of course, he lost because there were hundreds of thousands of votes that were not yet counted. They were heavily Democratic. So the fact that the reported outcome on the election day was almost equal meant that actually Democrats won with quite a big advantage. So this is something that was well understood by election analysts. This was something that was not understood perhaps by the public. So the questions that we ask in this paper is, who were the protesters that come to the District of Columbia on January 6th? and when did they come. So what we do in this paper, we track mobile devices of visitors, of those who were on January 6th in Washington, D.C., to learn something about the communities they come from. We do not track individuals. I'll talk a little bit about this later. We track their communities. We don't want to use the data that tells us everything about specific individuals. Then we build a theory that explains how isolation, especially political isolation and geographical isolation, led to higher participation in the protest. And then we further analyze this data to understand more about protest participation. So let me look ahead to preview our empirical findings. Some of these empirical findings, they are totally straightforward. In the sense, there is nothing surprising about them. These are just what we would assume about the protesters if we just read newspapers or watch the TV news. So participation increased with Trump voter share. People came from the communities that voted for Trump. Obviously, this was a meeting that was called by President Trump. The idea was to press the Congress to overturn the election result. Then it was perhaps less expectedly, but still not entirely surprising. A lot of people came from isolated communities. So these were people who were not living in big cities, not being surrounded by a lot of other people who are like them. Again, non-surprisingly, participation increased with proximity to extremist right-wing organization, and participation increased with local use of a network for this kind of extremist use, the network Parler. And these results, they are true basically whatever you do with the data. So it's extremely robust to alternative specifications or alternative methods. But one interesting thing that were novel is that participation in these protests, it has sharply increased with the narrow Trump losses, and exactly in those counties where there was a Trump-Biden swing in the election night voter tally. So people came from places in which Trump lost, so they were concerned about the outcome, and it looked on the election day evening that Trump has won. So it's indirect evidence, but it's sort of evidence that people who came to the January 6th protest, they were genuinely concerned about the election integrity. So it's not like people were coming to Washington to overturn the election results. They were coming to Washington thinking that the election was stolen from them, and they need to restore the election integrity. So as usual in economics research, we start with a theory. So we will have a model in which voters acquire information not only from public media, radio, websites, newspapers, but also from members of their social network. Then, after they obtain information, they decide what they believe in, whether to go to Washington to protest elections or not to protest elections. And we assume about these voters that they protest if they believe that votes were stolen, or they stay home if there was no suspected election fraud. I'm a theorist. My co-authors do empirical work. So we work together, but most of my work is theory. I teach game theory, I teach microeconomics at the Harris School. So I'll tell you briefly about some challenges about modeling information manipulation. Because whenever you read about information manipulation, propaganda, persuasion, influence in media, or when you talk to a lay person, then most of what they would tell about the work of propaganda is sort of mechanical. Someone tells a lie and voters just believe this lie. But this would not work in an economics model, and in fact, this does not work in the real life. So if you would speak to those who specialize in commercial advertising, in marketing, they will tell you exactly this, that people do not naturally believe advertising. People are not that gullible. People are not easily persuadable. So, and also people know that they're being persuaded. People are not stupid. People in Russia today know that what they learn from the state media is censored media. In my childhood in the Soviet Union, of course, all the news were heavily curated, but of course I knew that these news are heavily curated. So it's important when we have a theory of propaganda is that the target, those who are being persuaded, they should know that they're being influenced. Also, they should know how they're being influenced. So people in China know what the topics that are censored on the China TV. So people in the United States, when they watch Fox News or MSNBC, they know that these channels are biased and potentially they might take into account this bias. So economists typically put modeling propaganda into a class of models that called the sender-receiver framework. So in such models, there are actors, sender, and the receiver. The sender has access to more information than the receiver, so sender has an informational advantage. Then sender shares some of this information, perhaps selectively with the receiver, and the receiver acts. So the sender might want the receiver to do something that the receiver wouldn't want to do. And using information provided by the sender influences the receiver's work. So in our model, there is a sender and there are receivers. A sender, it's a Trump-supported media, or President Trump himself on Twitter, or Breitbart News, or maybe some shows on the Fox News. And there are many receivers who are potential protesters in communities that are connected in a network. So citizens want to protest if there is election fraud. They want to stay home if there is no election fraud. So the sender is interested in citizens' participation regardless of whether there was election fraud or not election fraud. A politician just wants to stay in power. So there is a difference in the interest, and there is a possibility for the politician to share information in a way that influences the receivers. So I'm not going to go into details there. There is a big literature. There are complicated mathematical models of influence, but one conclusion of this literature is sort of straightforward, that the optimal information, the optimal from the sender standpoint, the information that provides maximum manipulation has to be a mix, a combination of some true information and information which is not true, which is favorable to the sender, right? Because if the information is totally skewed into the sender's favor, then who would trust this information? Nobody would read this media, which always tells the same thing. But of course, if the media tells only the truth, then there is no effect of persuasion. So the optimal persuasion from the sender standpoint is a combination of these two things. It's a mix of truthful information and information that manipulates the receiver. So in addition, our model has a network of agents. So we have a lot of citizens who are connected in a network, which is modeled as a graph. And information passes from one member to another is passing through this graph. So consider, for example, the following network. This is just an arbitrary network. Then we allow some of the citizens to get information from the media. Every citizen makes a decision in our model whether to consume information directly from the media, or to expect that they would know the same news from their neighbors. So here in this picture, those who are marked blue, these are people who decided to watch the Fox News show or subscribe to Breitbart News, or they are following they were following President Trump. So these are direct consumers of news. Then there are people who talk to other people. So the gray line are potential connections, and the black lines are the actual connections. So this happens randomly in the model, and this is people conversing one to each other. So now, after some people being direct receivers of information and some people talking to those who already have this information, we have a set of citizens who are informed, right? So the dark blue people, they are direct consumers. The people who are light blue, they're indirect consumers of information. Finally, people who are white, they are uninformed, right? They were not lucky enough to receive information from, for example, this person didn't receive information from this friend, and this friend, of course, if a person has a higher centrality, is connected to more people, then there is a higher chance that this citizens receives an information. Okay, so what happens in the model? First, the sender, the pro-Trump media, chooses the optimal bias of the news. Then citizens decide whether to get information from the sender or not to get information, and getting information from the sender is costly. It requires time to watch a Hannity show. It requires to pay money if you subscribe to a certain news media. So there is a cost associated with this. And of course, the citizens' willingness to pay this cost depends on the amount of bias that the media have chosen, right? If the news are completely uninformative, then nobody would subscribe to this news. Then, after this decision is made, citizens receive information from through their network connections, either directly from those who are informed, or either directly from the media or from other citizens indirectly. After that, citizens decide, based on the information they have, whether to go to protest. Okay, so the main result of this model is that people in more isolated communities are more likely to receive a signal from the media, from the leader, that elections were fraudulent and choose to participate in the protest. This might be sort of counterintuitive. How could it be that a person who is more isolated is more likely to receive information? But it's exactly because to receive information, you need to either get the information directly or to rely to your network connections. So those people who are isolated, they have lower chances to get their information indirectly, so they're more likely to go to the Breitbart News website and get the information from there. In fact, this is empirically true. These people go there and get the information. Then, of course, the higher willingness to protest, conditional on getting information that the elections were stolen, leads to a higher willingness to acquire information. So those people who were predisposed, who were Trump voters, they were more eager to get this information, and there was a higher chance that they will get a signal that the elections were stolen and go to Washington. So of course, there were a huge amount of empirical challenges in this study, because whenever there is a collective action, whenever there is a protest or something in which a lot of people participate, then whatever we do to analyze why people are there and who these people are there are a lot of possible biases, because people self-select into protests basically based on their social characteristics, based on their preferences. So when people try to study why people come to protests, they do surveys, they embed researchers in movements or near sites of the collective protests. They asked questions about participation, but the problem with the questions is that is that the questions might reflect a lot of biases, a lot of preference falsification, rather than to reveal the true thinking of people who came there, right? So one option to overcome this is to focus on communities rather than individuals. But the problem is that most protests around the world, most protests in the United States, they are specially proximate to the places where people live. This was different from the January 6th protest because this was a protest for which people come from all the United States. So what we do device location for people who visited Washington in these hours on January 6th, and we link these to social media posts, their participation in networks, their geographical location, their activity on other days, to determine what caused their participation. So in our study, we use anonymous aggregated data from a panel of 40 million mobile devices. So the data set is aggregated from the GPS pings. That's what mobile companies have, and that's what mobile companies provided us. They do, before sharing this data with the researcher, they create a demographically representative sample. So they're doing some work for us because, of course, it's not legal to share the individual data. So about each device that was there in Washington in the hours of the protests, we know the community where this device typically resides. So the precision of the community is basically, on average, it's like 40 blocks. So we know 200,000 communities in the United States where people come from. So then, of course, we do not know who was a protester, who was a tourist, right? So if some person came to Washington, D.C., it was there around the Capitol on January 6th, then this might have been someone who came for the protest or someone who came to visit Washington, D.C. So we need to do additional statistical procedures to figure out who were actual protest participants. Okay, so we have a nice picture illustrating where these people come from. So they mostly come from the states which voted for Trump, from the counties in which Trump lost, but lost narrowly. We use other sources of data. For example, we employed the Internet Archive of a prominent alt-right social media platform. We use data on locations of local chapter or far-right neo-fascist hate group. It's the same hate group that was famously told by President Trump to stand back and stand by during the presidential debate before the elections. We looked at the voting patterns at the level of these communities and used basically all possible demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of the communities. Then we constructed an original measure of political isolation. So we sort of give a precise meaning to the notion of what is to be in a Trump community surrounded by democratically voting community. So basically for each community, we looked at those communities that are islands in the communities with a different political affiliation. And then what we've demonstrated in our statistical results, that these communities, they were very disproportionately represented among those people who came to Washington, D.C. So we collected this data, we constructed the measure of political isolation, we did statistical analysis, and the results are as follows. As promised and as expected, people who came there were predominantly people who vote for Trump, from communities that voted for Trump. then they also come predominantly not from just Trump-supporting communities, but from those Trump-supporting communities that are surrounded by the Biden-supporting communities. So there was a measure of political isolation which played an important role in our theory. People are more likely to receive information about the elections, about the possible election fraud or accusations about the election fraud if they were more isolated, so they were not able to rely that much on their social networks. Other regular usual suspects played a role, so participation in the protests increased with the proximity of a Proud Boys chapter and increases with the use of this alt-right network. It's perhaps our results show that it was not that important as some journalistic accounts emphasize, because if you read what journalists were writing, what commentators were writing without analyzing data after January 6 events, then it was all about Proud Boys, all about extreme right, all about the network of the extreme right. What we say, it was not the most important thing. It was the isolation was a more important effect. Another thing that we further did is we analyzed those states in which the voting shares were very close. So what we see that in those states in which Trump narrowly lost, there was a lot of people participating in the protests. In those states with similar demographic characteristics, with similar political characteristics, where Trump narrowly won, there was very little protest participation, which means, I mean, if this were not about the election outcome, if it were just about people doing what President Trump asked them to do, to come to Washington to march on the Capitol, then there would be no this effect, right? It would not depend on whether it's a loss or a narrow win by candidate Trump. But actually, this is a robust effect that the narrow loss resulted in a much more protest. So people were not just asked by President Trump to come to Washington and support him. These were people who were actually concerned about the election results. Again, like most of the narratives tell this story about people belonging to some extremist groups, people being like strong Trump supporters. What our results say, it's not about that. It's certainly about that. Certainly, proximity to extremist group helped. Certainly, they were influenced by what President Trump said. But also, it was very important that this was about the electoral outcome. People in the states which Trump lost, they were more likely to come to Washington to protest. Basically, a similar thing is pointed out by the data on the states in which there was a Trump to Biden overnight swing. So this allows us to further look into the people's mind. Not only they were concerned about the election integrity generally, they were actually paying attention to the reports, to the reported voting. So when professionals, people who do election analysis, who are doing professionally statistical analysis of elections, they knew that in these states they're going to have another overnight swing. So if basically Pennsylvania votes, the vote count is equal on the election day, then when the mail vote is counted, when the absentee ballots are counted, then this will be a Democratic advantage. So professionals knew this. This was all written and described before, but apparently people who were just watching elections, the potential protesters, they did not they didn't appreciate this complex analysis about the different state having different rules. They interpret this sudden swing in the vote as an evidence of the electoral fraud, and came to Washington, D.C. to protest the electoral fraud. Again, while most narratives focused on these people being just extremists or people who were just blind Trump supporters, what our results show that these people were actually concerned about the integrity of the elections, plus they were following the signs and their actions were triggered by what they have interpreted, of course, falsely. The elections were not stolen, but the signs, they incorrectly interpreted this as if the elections were stolen and came to Washington, D.C. to protest against the stolen elections. So this has an implication going forward, right? Because a lot of people on the Democratic side, a lot of people who care about democratic priorities, a lot of people who despise Donald Trump and those who support him, they make a very strong argument that Democrats should win. People need to vote for Democrats because this is something that protects democracy, right? So in their narrative, Donald Trump tried to steal the elections. So voting Democrat is basically protects election integrity. So it's not only about preferring democratic policy, it's basically preferring people's right to vote. So what our results show, I mean, it's not a definitive conclusion, but it's still some evidence in support of this, that this might not be precisely a good idea of Democrats, because those people who came to Washington to protest on January 6th, they actually thought that they are protecting democracy. So they actually interpreted the information that they received as if it was pointing out that the democracy is in danger. So they came there to protest against violation of the democratic elections. Okay, so in this paper, to conclude, we do several things. We study a violent protest in a mature and a very stable democracy, which is a rarity. Our data allows us to say something about people, to learn a lot about the people who came, and say something about the motivations of the people that came to Washington. It's really rare when the data tell us not only about what happened or who participated in a protest, but also what was on these people's minds. Sociologists would ask people what they think. Economists try not to ask people. Economists try to conclude from the people's actions what they think. So this time we'll look at what information people received, and we show that acting on this information, they came to Washington, D.C. This is our way to get into people's heads and interpret what they're thinking about. We build a theory. A theory demonstrates that this counterintuitive idea that a more isolated person or a more isolated community might actually be better informed when, as it is realistic, to get some information you need to pay a cost, or you might need to exert some effort. Then an isolated person might actually got more propaganda, got more influence than a person who is embedded in a social network more centrally. So we have a model. Then our data analysis confirmed that more isolated communities were producing disproportionately many participants in the protests. And yeah, as I said, that the Trump to Biden swing apparently played an important role, which means that people who came to Washington, D.C., they actually had the election integrity in mind. So I'll better stop here. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Professor Sonin. While we wait for any questions to come into the chat, I just want to note that one of the facets of this presentation I hope people found valuable, I mean, I certainly did, is the idea of the data analytics. How for this example, the analysis provides evidence and context that confirm, in this case, ideas that people perhaps suspected. But the thing is, if you're interested, and I hope the folks here who are attending are, if you're trying to make an impact with policy, you don't need to just have the cleanest data to support your proposals, which we're seeing here, but you also need to be able to present it and discuss it in a way like Professor Sonin did. So in case your audience isn't as versed in theory or data as some folks are, they can still understand what you're communicating. That's something, Professor Sonin, I really appreciate with this. You really take this analysis and you make it so that it's understandable to the broadest audience, which I think is absolutely invaluable for folks who are, again, considering careers in policy. I will actually start with a question. Alexei asked, can this model be used to study political participation in authoritarian countries?
Okay, I actually have written a number of papers on authoritarian politics and election falsification. So some of these things are certainly have common common traits and the common origins, both in democratic countries and authoritarian countries. And when we study what happens in authoritarian countries, I'm not sure that we would be able, I mean, nobody has been able to get this kind of data. Also, unfortunately, that there are not that many authoritarian countries in which the election fraud protests actually make a difference. I've shown you the Philippines protest, in which the protests actually brought down the government that falsified the elections. There are some more examples, but a lot of protests are not directly related to the elections. So a lot of authoritarian governments, they fell, even if they fell because of the popular protests, they fell not directly, their fall is not directly related to elections. So in general, the methods are, I mean, these are great methods. My co-authors are the world best specialists in tracking the location devices. They use these methods in several contexts, including the war context in Ukraine, including other protests in the United States. So the methods are certainly good for using to study protests in authoritarian regimes. The data might not be that easily available.
Great. Thank you, Professor Sonin. A couple other questions have been coming in from Caroline, reaching out to us from Brazil. She said she was wondering if throughout your research, the team was able to find out what social media was more used to spread information. For example, she was saying in Brazil, WhatsApp and Telegram played a huge part in the event they dealt with on the 8th of January. Were you able to actually find more information on what social media were used to spread information?
You know what? It was already after we've written this paper, there appeared a whole group of papers. They were published simultaneously this fall in Nature, Science, and other journals that was done by the teams of prominent economists, just literally sitting on the data in major social networks in Facebook, they tried to study the question, the effect of social media on different political action. And what they found, it sort of runs against the common, like the public perception. Economists and political scientists who work with data, they long suspected this. Basically, social media are obviously very good in spreading information, both information and misinformation. But it's very difficult, if not outright impossible, to get any effect of the influence of social media on what people do. Basically, like, think of the context of this protest. Of course, those people who received information about the protest in Washington, of course, they disproportionately were sitting on those websites, on those social media influencers who spread this information. But we actually do not know in which direction the causal relationship works, right? Maybe they were sitting on these websites, maybe they were following these influencers exactly because they were more likely to come to these protests. And this is a major issue for economists who study the effect of social media. Everyone sits on the social media. The problem is that those who receive some specific information on the social media, these are exactly the same people who are likely to engage in this kind of activity, even if they would not have received this information through social media. They often come to social media to receive this information because they're going to be involved in this action. So this is a totally fascinating area of research, but I'm just saying that I would say the consensus in the economic profession is that although there's no question that social media spread information, it's a much more difficult proposition that social media does influence what people do in terms of politics.
And I want to thank Alexei. I want to thank you because your follow-up question set me up perfectly for what I want to share. Alexei asked, can this model be used to address the challenge of partisan division in the USA? Here's why I'm glad you asked that, Alexei, because our final masterclass on November 30th, which I'm sharing right now in the chat, is with Professor Anthony Fowler, and his topic is, are American voters really so polarized, partisan, or irrational? I will also let Professor Sonin answer this question, but I wanted to put that in there because you really set me up beautifully, Alexei. I want to give you credit for that. But yeah, I would encourage folks to attend this final session that comes up in a month. And then, so do you, Professor Sonin, what you would say about this?
Okay, so the question is how this help with political polarization?
Yeah, can this model be used to address the challenge of partisan division in the U.S.?
Okay, the problem with the partisan division is that it's obviously there. It's not that clear, and there is no consensus. There is no consensus at all on the issue why we live in the era of such a huge political polarization. For example, it seems that the rise of the social media has contributed mightily to the rise of the political polarization, but it's certainly the rise of the political polarization started well before, decades before, the social media appeared on the horizon. So the social media is something that's 20 years old. The rise in political polarization in the United States, it's at least 40 years. It's at least since early 80s, right? And it was rising. So, like, I think the good news is that American politics seems to be so much polarized these days that it almost has nowhere to go but down in terms of polarization. So the polarization today is very high by standards of the recent decades, but it's basically very close to the polarization of 120 years ago in the United States. So maybe we're living just like in this peak part of a huge cycle, so it will eventually goes down. Although like immediately it doesn't look very good, but it doesn't, I mean, I'm not sure it can be even much more polarized than today because it's already so much polarized.
Actually, Professor Sonin, this leads, I believe, to Kevin's question, which is, should the context this model brings be used to alleviate sentences of those prosecuted for their involvement in the January 6th insurrection?
Okay, I'm not a legal scholar, and what I observe is, I mean, I do not do legal analysis, but what I see in the prosecution of the writers of the January 6, 2021, is that the focus of the prosecution is on actual action. So people are not getting prosecuted for participation in the protests. They're getting prosecuted for someone for killing a police officer, someone for breaking into the Capitol building, someone for threatening the officers of the state. And there could be different like philosophical argument, but I think that the legal approach here is that the judge does not question the intentions. Basically, the judges, the jurors, they say that it was the defender's right to come to Washington, D.C. to protest against for the election integrity. It was not their right to kill a police officer. It was not their right to storm a Capitol building, which I think is a kind of workable legal approach.
Actually, and so to pivot back to the analysis, Yoon asked if you can talk a little bit more about how you came up with and then narrowed down the hypothesis to test regarding the participants' motivation for protest.
Okay, I would say that in the applied empirical work, as well as in the applied theoretical work, most, I think, interesting insights, the starting points, they typically come from anecdotes. So you read a story of a person who genuinely believed that the elections are stolen, went to Washington, participated in this. So basically, the research part, not the starting part, the research part, is to check whether the anecdote, whether one story is a part of some general phenomena. But I do not believe in general phenomena which do not have a lot of small anecdotes. So basically, if you have a theory and it's not confirmed by a single anecdote, then perhaps it's a bad theory. And vice versa, if you have an anecdote, it does not mean that this is a general phenomena. This is what we do, what we check when we collect data and analyze data. But the starting point is a story, is an anecdote, is a specific episode.
Lucas commented that the regression discontinuity results seem to show that states where Biden won by large majorities also produced a disproportionate number of protesters. And was that result expected?
Okay, this somewhat this result is related to the political isolation, because political isolation is a major determinant. So it's very significant what mattered that you are in a Trump voting district, Trump voting community. I mean, it's much smaller than an electoral district, and a Trump voting community which is surrounded by Biden Democratic voting communities. And of course, there are a lot of such communities in democratic states, right? So, for example, a red state like Wyoming or Alabama, they might have less of these communities because they do not have enough democratic communities to surround a Republican community. Vice versa, in New York State or in California, you could have a Republican community which is surrounded by Democrats. So this is a different effect. It's not the Trump to Biden overnight swing effect. but it's also contributes to democratic state having their representatives in the protest.
Thank you, Professor Sonin. Be mindful of everybody's time. I want to take one more question. Jonathan had the question, which is, in light of recent events such as the Palestinian protests across the U.S., he was wondering if there were pockets of January 6th protests around the U.S. which were included in the study. So, for example, what can we learn from protesters who travel great distances versus those who protest in their own localities?
Okay, I haven't seen a single even like semi-academic study on the pro-Hamas or mostly pro-Palestinian protests. I think that I'm not even sure that this analysis will appear because it's still, I mean, these events, they got so much media attention, but these are actually very small events, right? So we've seen something happening at Harvard, we've seen something happening at UPenn, and then it was amplified because it's constantly shown on media, it's constantly discussed on social media, but these are very small events, and most of the participants were students of these particular universities. And I mean, you could just have a list of these students, and it's not something that would give like statistical power to analyze. People, I have not heard about people traveling more than, I don't know, a couple of blocks to participate in these protests. In Chicago, we had protests in support of Palestine, but it was sort of totally locally driven. And again, it was in hundreds of people. It was not like 10,000 people. So I'm not sure that we could say anything serious about this statistically.
All right. Again, thank you, Professor Sonin, for this presentation. Thank you all for joining us this evening here in Chicago. I'm going to share a couple more things in the chat before I wind up. First, if you happen to be in the Washington, D.C. area, we have some coffee chats coming up so you can speak to some admissions folks. I also want to mention our next application deadline is we just talked about January 6th, is December 6th. Next application deadline is December 6th. And I wanted to remind everybody that we are trying to reduce barriers for prospective students. And this year we have eliminated the application fee for master's degree applicants. So just a link to the application to continue if you wish. And then I also strongly encourage everybody, if you are interested in, say, the MACRM program or the PhD program, you have questions about writing your application letters or talk to your letters of recommendation or your application essays, check out our upcoming events. We have things coming up throughout the month of November. Again, thank you all very much for spending time with us this evening, and a special thank you, Professor Sonin, for this presentation. I hope everybody has a good rest of their day, and thank you again for joining us.